In this video, I'm going to cover a few features unique to the graphical user interface of CrystoGen. I'm not going to go through setting up a simulation tab by tab. I'm just going to show you some extra things that the GUI can do, which might make setting up your simulations easier. Setting up your simulations from scratch are covered in many other videos on this channel. So the first thing I'm going to show is how you load up a previous simulation. So if I click this open button here, I can navigate to a completed simulation. So this is my AFI simulation here, a Zeolite framework. I can click this GUI simulation data, which is created whenever you submit a simulation. So if I click this and open it, it will populate all of the fields that I filled in when I ran this simulation previously, and it will also run the structure file. If I was using a net-based structure, it would read in the structure file and the energy file, so the net.txt. So if I go through these tabs quickly, you can see they've all been filled in with some data. If I wanted to, I could just run the simulation now and it would run with all the same parameters as this previous simulation. Or if I wanted to change a few settings, I could go to the correct tab and change the parameter that I want. It's a quick way of setting up simulations without having to do them all from scratch again. So let's say I wanted to change to mode 5, I could just change that. And let's say I wanted a driving force of 20 kcal per mole as my second delta mu for mode 5. If I didn't want to run this simulation straight away and just come back to it later, you can press save here. You can save a text file which is in the same format as this GUI simulation data here to access later. So I can call this GUI simulation data 2 and I'll be able to reopen this later. So if I reopen my first one, you can see it changes back to mode 3. If I open my second one, it will change to mode 5. If I move on to the Change Default Values box on the sidebar here, I'll be able to change what the CrystoGen GUI sets as the default options when I open up the program. Currently it's set to net. If I wanted it to default to tile-based structures, I could change this to tile. And then whenever I open the program, it will set the first tab, Structure Options, it will set it as tile instead of net. And you can change pretty much every default option in CrystoGen in this window here. So if I wanted to always have a screw dislocation, I could change this to yes. If I always wanted to run in growth modifier mode, I could change this to growth_modifier, same as it is here, and it would always open with growth modifier selected. The one you're most likely to change will probably be simulation options number of iterations. We default to 1 million to start with, but that is quite a short simulation. So you'd be more likely to use 10 million iteration simulations, so that would be a good use of this option here. And then you can press Save and Close Window to save those options. So now if I go to my Simulation Options tab, you can see it's currently still set as 1 million, but if I close and reopen the graphical user interface, and go to the tab Simulation Options, you can see it's now changed to 10 million iterations. And it's also defaulted to a tile-based structure. The next entry in the sidebar is the Advanced Options tab. So these are options that you wouldn't normally want to mess with using CrystoGen, but you might want to change this option, for example, which is if you were looking at internal defects in your crystal structure. This is covered in a separate video. Then if we wanted to look at help, you can click this and it opens up a small window here, and you can choose which help page you want to visit. So for example, I wanted to look at tile options, I would click that, and then it would open a web page which links to the CrystoGen website where we have the manual page that you've requested. This works the same way as if we went to the tile options page and then clicked this click here for help option here. They both go to the same page. Now if we go to the final entry in the sidebar here, View and Edit Interaction Groupings, this is for net-based structures. So this is the same window that appears when you actually read in your net energy file, your net.txt. It just reopens that same window. The final feature I'm going to show is the way that you can automate a series of simulations to run through the graphical user interface. So if I reopen my AFI simulation that we were looking at the beginning of this video, I can now pick some parameters that I want to vary across a series of simulations. So let's say I went back to our supersaturation profile page And let's say, for example, I wanted to see how setting a different delta mu for the second phase of the simulation affects the overall crystal morphology and surface topology. I could just run a series of simulations where I keep changing this value here, but that's quite inefficient and can take up a lot of user time. So the user interface has a tool built in where you can set up a series of simulations with these parameters changing. So if I tick this vary box here, it asks what's my start value for this parameter, what's my end value for this parameter, and what's my step size. So let's say I wanted to start at 5 kcal per mole and end at 25, and I wanted to do this in steps of 5 kcal per mole. This will set up a few simulations where this one parameter is incrementing by 5 kcal per mole. So if I click Summarize, I can see how many simulations it's going to run, and I can see the value assigned to this parameter that's varying. So if I close this and press Run Crystal Grower, it'll start running that series of simulations. Because it's running 5, it might take a bit of time. But it'll give you an update every time a simulation is completed in this window here. So now our simulation series is complete. You can see that there's a report of each of those simulations completing in this notifications tab here. If I go to the folder where I saved those simulations, in my simulations folder, AFI_GUI, this most recent simulation here, you can see they're separated into 5 folders. So depending on the options that I picked in Crystal Grower, particularly the option here on the Simulation Options tab, how do you wish to store visualizer files, this will define where these XYZ files are kept. So I'll go back to my simulation folder. If I go in this XYZ files folder here, you can see all the visualization files from my simulation series are in here. So I can open these in a Veto or the Crystal Grower visualizer and use the high throughput methodologies in those programs to study them all quickly. So in a Veto I can just quickly flick through all of these. Using the Crystal Grower visualizer, I could process all these files in one go and get a series of images. The rest of my data will be in each individual simulation folder. So this will be all my text file output. And also there's an Excel file here which contains the information that was shown in that summary tab before I ran my simulations. So it's got the parameter that was changed and the simulation ID. You're not limited to just one parameter to vary. You can vary as many as you want, but just remember that when you start combining variables, Crystal Grower is going to run a simulation for each combination of those parameters. So you're going to end up with a lot of simulations very quickly. So if I'm running 5 simulations currently with this setting here, let's say I also wanted to have a look at how changing this length here, the number of iterations at high driving force, affect the crystal morphology too. I can tick the vary box here. Say I wanted to start with 100,000 iterations, and I wanted to end at having 500,000 iterations, and I wanted to do this in a step of 100,000 iterations. I could then click Summarize here, and you can see I've now got 25 simulations that I'm going to run. Because we've got 5 simulations here, 5 simulations here, all the combinations of those, 5 times 5, 25 simulations. So you have to be a bit careful with these options here. But it's a really powerful tool to queue up loads of simulations. So while these are all running sequentially, you can go and spend your time doing something else. The one final thing I'll mention is actually the location for storing your log file for these simulations. So the log file is defined on this page here, and the log file will keep track of every simulation that you've run, all the parameters that you've put into them. So there's a record of every simulation that you've run with Crystal Grower that you can look back on. So by default, this is stored in a hidden folder. So on Windows, if you go to your C drive, you go to your users folder and your current username, so this is mine, there's a folder here called .crystalgrower. It's in the equivalent place on Mac or Ubuntu systems. It's in your home directory, which is your users / whatever your username is. So if I go in this folder here, you can see I've got my log file here and also the defaults file. So this is where the default parameters are actually written to when we set them in Crystal Grower. So if I open my log file, you can see I've now got a record of all the simulations I've run with Crystal Grower. So if I expand all these columns, You can see it's got the date, the time, the structure file I used, and a lot of other information that I've put into the program. Important one here is the code version. So this is the version of CrystalGrower that was used to produce this simulation. So let's say I wanted to save that in a more accessible location. I can do that in the CrystalGrower user interface. So if I go back to CrystalGrower and go to the Simulation Options tab, I'm going to choose a new location to save my log file. So I'll save it in my simulations folder. And then I can rerun those simulations, and the record will now be saved to a new log file at this location. Now my new set of simulations is completed, I can close my previous log file and navigate to my simulations folder and open my new log file. So if I expand all the columns again, you can see that only those last 5 simulations have been recorded in this log file. The same information stored, time and date and all the simulation parameters, but now it's saved in a new location. So that was a few tips on how to use the graphical user interface, some of the features unique to the graphical user interface. Check out the other videos to see how you fill in these tabs and how changing the parameters affects the outcome of your simulation.